The train pulled away before she could change her mind about staying on it. That was the part Evelyn Hart would remember later, in the quiet hours before sleep came. How the engine didn't linger, didn't slow, just exhaled one long hiss of steam and rolled west without her, as if it had delivered its cargo and wanted no more part in what came next. She stood on the platform at Black Creek Station and watched the last car diminish into gray until there was nothing left to watch. And then she stood a little longer anyway, because turning around meant facing whatever was in front of her, and she wasn't entirely ready for that. The platform was warped pine, old enough that the nailheads had sunk below the surface and left the boards to buckle on their own judgment. A lantern hung from a hook near the station master's door and threw a circle of amber light that stopped well short of where she stood. December had arrived early to this part of the territory, or at least that was how it felt. The air had an edge to it that wasn't just cold, it was deliberately cold, the kind that found the gaps in your clothing and settled in your collar and didn't plan on leaving. Evelyn set her bag down beside her feet. It was a single leather case, medium-sized, and it held everything she'd decided was worth carrying. 2 dresses, a spare pair of boots she hadn't broken in yet, her notepaper and ink, a short-handled hairbrush, and a tin of peppermint lozenges her last employer had given her as a parting gift, which she suspected was as much to avoid a more meaningful farewell as anything else. She was 31 years old, and she had been, at various points in her life, a schoolmistress's assistant in Ohio, a household organizer in Pittsburgh, a letter writer for a wool merchant in Missouri who couldn't spell and didn't want anyone to know it, and most recently, a domestic manager for the Whitfield family in Kansas City, a position that had ended when Mrs. Whitfield decided she didn't need a woman with opinions keeping her household. Evelyn had opinions. She'd tried not to, but they kept surfacing. She'd come to Black Creek on the strength of a letter. 3 paragraphs, formal and precise, written on cream stationery and signed by a Mrs. Caroline Aldred, who had described herself as a rancher's wife in need of a capable household manager for an extended arrangement. The letter had included a train ticket, second class but still, and the promise of a proper reception at the station. Someone would be there to meet her. Those had been the exact words. Someone will be there to meet you. Evelyn looked down the length of the platform. At the far end, a dog was sleeping against the wall of the freight office. Other than that, the platform was empty. She waited 20 minutes. She waited because she was that kind of woman, the kind who held to the arrangement even when the arrangement was failing, because breaking it first felt like admitting something about herself she wasn't prepared to admit. She stood in the bitter cold with her bag at her feet and her breath clouding the air in small, visible exhalations, and she waited. And nobody came. Eventually, she picked up her bag and walked into the station. The station master was a heavy-set man with a gray mustache and the look of someone who had answered the same 4 questions so many times that the answers no longer required any actual thought. He told her, without much ceremony, that the Aldred place was 6 miles northeast, that they didn't keep a cab at this hour, that the boarding house was 2 blocks down on the left, and that he closed at 9. It was 8:40. "Is there a way to send word?" she asked. "To the Aldred household. Not at this hour." He said it with a kind of comfortable finality, the way you'd say the river runs east or winter comes in December, a fact requiring no apology. "I see." She kept her voice level. She'd learned that early, the value of a level voice. It gave people less to work with. "Thank you." The boarding house was called the Meridian, which was a grander name than the building deserved. It was 2 stories of weathered clapboard with a sign that had survived several hard seasons and looked like it. The woman who ran it, a Mrs. Pell, had a face that suggested she'd heard most stories and believed very few of them. She gave Evelyn a room on the 2nd floor with a window that looked onto the side wall of the building next door, and a bed with a quilt that smelled of cedar and old wool, and she charged 60 cents for the night plus 2 cents for the candle. Evelyn lay in the dark for a long time without sleeping. She was cold and slightly hungry, and she was doing the arithmetic in her head. Not the anxiety arithmetic of disaster, but the practical kind, the kind that helped her think. She had $11.40. She had a return ticket to Kansas City that she'd purchased herself as insurance because she'd learned not to rely entirely on other people's assurances. She had no position. She had 1 leather bag and an unbroken pair of boots and a tin of peppermint lozenges. She thought about Mrs. Caroline Aldred, who had apparently decided not to send anyone to the station, and she thought about what that meant. and she thought about what she was going to do about it. Morning in Black Creek came grudgingly. The light filtered through a skin of cloud and arrived at the world looking apologetic. Evelyn was dressed and at breakfast before 7, hard biscuits with butter and a pot of coffee that was genuine, if not good, and by 8 o'clock she had hired a man named Tuckett, who had a cart and a mule and not much else in the way of conversation, to take her northeast. The road was frozen mud and ruts. The mule navigated it with the resignation of an animal that had made its peace with discomfort. Tuckett said nothing for the first mile and then said, "You going to the Aldrids?" And when she confirmed it, he nodded and said nothing else. The country out here was wide and cold and remarkable in a way she hadn't expected. Flat through the middle, but angled up at the edges, with ridges of dark pine on the northern slopes, and the whole landscape pressed under a sky that was the particular gray of old pewter. There wasn't much snow yet, but there was the threat of it. That certain quality of stillness in the air, like a held breath. The Aldred Ranch was smaller than she'd imagined from the letter. A main house with a covered porch, 2 outbuildings, a corral with 3 horses standing at the near fence, and a kitchen garden that had been put to bed for winter, the beds mounded and staked. A woman came out onto the porch when the cart came up the track. Late 40s, narrow-shouldered, wearing an expression that had committed to displeasure before she'd even confirmed who was arriving. "Miss Hart?" The woman said it the way you'd say there's a problem. "Yes." Evelyn climbed down from the cart, retrieved her bag. "Mrs. Aldred, I was expecting you yesterday." Something in Evelyn went very still, the way it did when she was deciding how to respond to something that deserved a sharper answer than the situation allowed. "I arrived on the train yesterday evening," she said, "as scheduled. I waited at the station for some time. No one came to meet me. My husband had business." Mrs. Aldred said it like that resolved the matter. "You'll need to understand that on a working ranch, arrangements don't always hold." "I understand that," Evelyn said. "I spent the night at a boarding house in town. I'd like to discuss the terms of the position when you have a moment." "Yes." Mrs. Aldred pulled her shawl tighter. "About that. Come inside." The kitchen was warm and smelled of biscuits and wood smoke. 2 children, boys, maybe 10 and 7, sat at the table playing cards and looked up with the unguarded curiosity that children had not yet learned to disguise. A man stood by the window with his back to the room and didn't turn when Evelyn came in. "My husband, Edgar," Mrs. Aldred gestured. The man turned. He was a thin man with a permanent-looking squint and the air of someone in the middle of a long argument with himself. He gave Evelyn a short nod. "Miss Hart." He looked at his wife. "Sit down, please." Mrs. Aldred set a cup of coffee in front of Evelyn without asking whether she wanted it, which Evelyn interpreted correctly as a woman who needed something to do with her hands. "I'll be direct." "Please," Evelyn said. "We've had a change in circumstances. My sister has agreed to come from Wichita to assist with the household, which means the position as described in my letter is no longer available." The kitchen was quiet except for the sound of the wood in the stove and the boys' cards on the table. The man by the window looked out the window. Evelyn wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. It was hot, and she appreciated the heat, and she kept her face neutral while she thought through what was actually happening here, which was that she had traveled 600 miles and spent her last boarding money on a position that had evaporated before she'd even seen the room she was meant to sleep in. "I see," she said. "When did your sister make this offer?" "Last week." "After you sent the letter and the train ticket?" "Yes." Mrs. Aldred had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable. "I apologize for the inconvenience." Evelyn set the cup down. "I'd like to be reimbursed for the boarding house," she said, "and for the time I spent on a train that was arranged under a commitment you've now withdrawn." "Now just a—" the man by the window started. "Edgar." Mrs. Aldred cut him off, and it was interesting, Evelyn noted, how quickly he stopped. "Of course," Mrs. Aldred said to Evelyn. "We'll cover the boarding cost. I'll have Edgar drive you back to town." That would be appreciated. She drank the coffee because she had paid for it in ways they didn't fully understand, and because she was cold, and because she had learned a long time ago that dignity didn't require you to refuse the things that were useful. Edgar drove her back to town in a silence that was more shame than anything else, which told her something about him that was worth knowing, and at the edge of Black Creek he gave her $2.50, which was more than the boarding house had cost, and told her there was a woman named Mrs. Pell who ran a decent boarding house on the left. "I know," she said. "I stayed there last night." He looked away. "I'm sorry we couldn't make it work," he said, and unlike his wife, he seemed to mean it. "It wasn't a matter of making it work," she said. "The position was offered and then withdrawn. Those are different things." She climbed down from the wagon. "Thank you for the ride." She walked into town carrying her bag and a very specific feeling she'd had before. Not quite despair and not quite anger, but something that lived in between them. A tight, focused kind of clarity that came when circumstances had gotten bad enough that she stopped imagining alternatives and started looking at what was actually in front of her. What was in front of her was a frontier town in December with no prospects, about $12 total, and a return ticket to Kansas City that represented, depending on how she was thinking about it, either her escape or her failure. She went back to the Meridian. Mrs. Pell, to her credit, did not make a comment about the speed of Evelyn's return. She simply asked if she wanted the same room, and when Evelyn said yes, she handed over the same key and told her breakfast was at 7. That afternoon, Evelyn did what she always did when she needed to think. She walked. Black Creek was not a large town, but it was a working one. A feed store, a general dry goods, a smithy that produced a steady ring of metal on metal, a small brick building that served as a bank and land registry combined, a saloon, a church, and a scattering of private homes along the two main streets. She walked all of it, slowly, with her hands in her coat pockets, and her eyes taking inventory. She stopped at the dry goods store and bought a pad of writing paper and a bottle of ink, which felt either prudent or foolish depending on how the next few days went. She stopped at the land registry office and stood outside it for a moment, not going in, just reading the notice board beside the door, which had several posted announcements in various states of weathering. Most were official and dull. One was a month old and outlined a boundary dispute between neighboring ranches, resolved apparently in favor of the western claimant. One was a help wanted notice for a schoolroom position, already filled. And one, newer than the others, was a notice of land petition filed against the Hale Ranch by someone named Rafe Granger, asserting a boundary claim on the eastern pasture. She didn't know who the Hales were. She read the notice twice and moved on. She had dinner at the Meridian, salt pork and beans, acceptable, and was sitting in the small parlor writing a letter to a woman she knew in St. Louis who sometimes heard of positions when Mrs. Pell came in. "You're a household manager?" Mrs. Pell said it without preamble, which Evelyn had already identified as the woman's primary mode of communication. "Among other things," Mrs. Pell considered this, "there's a man comes into town Thursdays for supplies. Widower, 2 daughters, father living on the property. Name's Hale. Dawson Hale. He's got a ranch northeast, borders the Aldred place on the other side of the creek." Evelyn looked up. "I saw a notice at the registry office about a land claim. That'd be Granger's doing." Mrs. Pell's expression made clear what she thought of Granger without requiring her to say anything directly. "The Hales have been on that land 15 years. Dawson's wife passed 3 winters ago. He's managing alone. And you think he might need help?" "I think a man raising 2 daughters on a working ranch with an elderly father and a land claim hanging over his head is managing a great deal." She paused. "I don't involve myself in other people's business." "Of course not," Evelyn said. "His father, Silas Hale, comes in sometimes. He'll likely be at the dry goods tomorrow morning, early." She said nothing else and walked back to the kitchen, and Evelyn sat with her letter and thought about what she'd just been given, which wasn't an offer, but was something that functioned like one. Silas Hale was 73 years old, built like a man who had once been larger and had compressed himself over the years into something denser and more enduring. He wore a gray coat and a hat that had started its life as black and was now something more complicated. He was at the dry goods store at 8 in the morning, consulting a list written in handwriting that was painstaking and careful, as if the letters required individual convincing. Evelyn introduced herself directly because she'd found that indirection wasted time and occasionally created the impression she was uncertain, which was not an impression she could afford. "Mr. Hale," she said, "I'm Evelyn Hart. I came to Black Creek for a position with the Aldred household, which fell through. I'm currently without a placement. I understand from various people in town that you manage a working ranch with your son and that there may be a need for organized household assistance. I don't want to be rude with your time, so I'll be plain. I'm looking for work, I'm competent at it, and I'd like to know if there's a conversation worth having. Silas Hale looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man who had expected several things from his morning and had not expected this particular thing. He had very direct gray eyes, and they didn't waver. "How old are you?" he asked. 31. "From where?" "Originally Ohio, most recently Kansas City." "You have references?" "I have letters." She opened her coat and removed 3 folded papers from an inside pocket, which she extended to him. He read them. It took him longer than she expected, which told her he was actually reading them and not just glancing. Then he refolded them carefully and handed them back. "I'll speak to my son," he said. "That's all I can tell you." "That's all I'm asking." He looked at her again, the same steady assessment. "You'll need to come out to the ranch. Dawson doesn't make decisions about the household without seeing the situation himself." "I can come today if that's useful." "Tomorrow. I'll send the wagon in at 10. He went back to his list. She walked back to the Meridian and sat in her room and looked out the window at the side wall of the building next door. And she thought that she had spent 4 years in Kansas City being managed, and she had not liked it. And whatever came next was going to be different because she was going to make it different, and that was either a resolution or a fantasy, and she wouldn't know which until tomorrow. The wagon came at 10, driven by a man introduced only as Pete, who was somewhere between 40 and 60 and communicated entirely in directional nods. The road to the Hale Ranch was better maintained than the road to the Aldrids, graded at some point, the worst of the ruts packed with gravel, and the land it crossed was open range, the grass winter flat and brown gold, the sky above it the kind of clear that arrived after cold had driven everything else out. The Hale Ranch was bigger than she'd expected, and messier than the Aldrids in ways that felt honest rather than negligent. The main house was square and solid, built from planed lumber and chinked properly, with a porch that had 2 benches and a collection of boots in varying states of repair lined against the wall. 3 outbuildings, a barn, a workshop, and what looked like a combination feed store and tack room. A kitchen garden considerably larger than the Aldrids, dormant now but visibly well organized, the beds edged with stones. Fences that were functional, if not decorative. A chicken coop with actual chickens in it, pecking industriously at the frozen ground. 2 girls stood on the porch watching her climb down from the wagon. The older one was maybe 13, the younger 9 or 10. They had the same watchful quality, the kind that came from having learned that adults appeared and disappeared without reliable pattern. "I'm Evelyn Hart," she said. "What are your names?" The older one said, "Lila." Just that. A complete sentence. The younger one said, "Mara, did you bring the flour?" And then catching something in Lila's expression added, "Pete was supposed to bring flour." "I'm afraid I don't know what Pete brought," Evelyn said. "I came separately from the flour." Mara considered this. "Okay," she said, apparently satisfied. Dawson Hale came around the corner of the barn at a pace that suggested he had things to do and had allotted a specific portion of his morning to this particular thing. He was in his late 30s, somewhere around 40. It was hard to say because he was the kind of man whose face had settled early into something permanent and was now just living inside it. He was lean without being thin, with dark hair and the kind of hands that told you a man worked outside for a living. And he had a way of looking at her that was not unfriendly, but was absolutely direct. "Miss Hart." He stopped a few feet away and didn't offer his hand, which she interpreted as not rudeness, but caution. "My father told me about your situation." "Yes." "We're not looking for someone in a formal capacity." He said it plainly, not apologetically. "What I need is someone who can manage the household while I manage the ranch. My daughters need oversight, not instruction, they're not babies, but someone with sense looking after things. My father does what he can, but he's not young. What I do," she said, "is manage. Household, correspondence, schedule, supplies, medical needs, whatever the situation requires. I'm not decorative, and I don't need to be told the same thing twice." Something in his face shifted slightly. She couldn't have named exactly what it was, a fractional adjustment, like a door that's been opened a crack. "The room is small," he said. "It's off the kitchen. It's clean, but it's small." "I've had small rooms." "There's no salary arranged. I can offer room, board, and reasonable wages once I've seen the work. 1 week's trial. 1 week is fair, she said. I'd like to see the household before I commit, if that's possible. He looked at her for a moment. Not many people asked him for conditions. She watched him decide whether that bothered him. Come on then, he said, and walked toward the house. The house was organized in the way that a man with no help organizes a house, which was to say, it was functional, but it passed the threshold where functionality shaded into deterioration. The kitchen was the most lived-in room, and it showed. The table was clear and scrubbed, which told her someone was keeping up the minimum, but the shelves above the stove needed reorganization. The supply cupboard had been opened and closed many times without being properly restocked, and there was a cast-iron skillet that had developed a story she intended to address. The main room had 2 chairs and a settee and a writing desk that was being used as storage. The desk had good bones and was buried under 3 months of paper that had been set there to be dealt with later. This is where my daughters do their schoolwork, Dawson said, standing in the doorway of a smaller room where 2 wooden chairs faced a table covered with books, slates, and a lamp. Lila reads ahead of herself. Mara is better at figures. Do they have a teacher? They ride in for school twice a week. Mrs. Garrow. A pause. She's competent. He said it the way people said things they only partly believed. He showed her the small room off the kitchen. It was indeed small, with a single window, a narrow bed, a washstand, and a hook on the wall. The window faced east, which meant morning light, which she preferred. It'll do, she said. My father's room is at the back of the house. You'll see him mainly at meals. Does he eat with the family? When he's well enough, he has joint pain. Some mornings are worse than others. I'll need to know his habits, what he eats, what he avoids, any medicines. Dawson looked at her. You're moving quickly. You said 1 week, she said. If I'm going to demonstrate anything useful in 1 week, I need to start understanding the situation today. He was quiet for a moment, and then he did something she hadn't expected. He laughed. Not loudly, and not for very long, but it was a real laugh, a caught-off-guard kind, the kind that escapes before you've approved it. All right, he said, come sit at the kitchen table and I'll tell you what I know, which is probably less than you'll figure out on your own. The first week was not comfortable. Nobody pretended it was. Silas Hale sat across from her at the first dinner with the expression of a man reserving his judgment not out of courtesy, but out of strategy, and spent the meal asking her questions about Ohio in a tone that suggested he had information she didn't, and was waiting to see whether she'd contradict herself. She answered everything directly and without embellishment, and by the end of the meal he had switched from strategy to something that might eventually become respect. It would take time. Lila watched her from across every room. The girl had an intelligence that was almost inconvenient. She took in information quickly and filed it somewhere internal, and Evelyn could tell from the way she monitored every interaction that she had a system for evaluating adults and that Evelyn was currently in a probationary state. This was, Evelyn decided, entirely sensible. She didn't try to be Lila's friend. She was simply present and reliable and let the record speak. Mara was different, more immediate, more easily distracted, more likely to suddenly appear in a doorway with a question that had nothing to do with anything currently happening. She asked Evelyn on the 3rd day why she wasn't married. Mara? Lila said from behind her book. It's a fair question, Evelyn said. She was reorganizing the supply cupboard, which was going better than the first day's assessment. I haven't found the right arrangement for it. My papa hasn't either, Mara said. Since Mama. Mara. Lila again, slightly louder. He doesn't talk about her, Mara said, undeterred by her sister. But Grandpa Silas does sometimes. He says she was strong. That sounds like something to be. She could lift a feed sack by herself, 50 pounds. So can I, Evelyn said. Mara looked at her with new consideration. Really? Would you like to see? They went out to the feed room, and Evelyn lifted a 50-pound sack of grain, which was not graceful and required a solid moment of commitment. But she did it, and Mara's expression shifted decisively into something that looked like a revised assessment. She didn't see much of Dawson during the days. He was up before her. She could tell by the time she made it to the kitchen at 6. The coffee was already half gone. And out until dusk, and dinner was the primary time they occupied the same room. He asked her on the 4th evening how she was finding the work. The supply situation needs attention, she said. You're running low on several things that would cause problems in a snowstorm. I've made a list. She slid the paper across the table. He looked at it. I'll take care of it Thursday. There's also a fence post down on the east side of the kitchen garden. The deer will be through it if we get a warm day. He looked up. When did you see that? Yesterday? I walked the perimeter when the girls were doing their reading. It's how I learn a property. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she was learning to read. That slight adjustment, the fraction of a door thing. Then he nodded and looked back at the list. She didn't know what he thought of her. He was not a man who offered information about his interior without strong cause. And she respected that, and she didn't try to extract it. What she knew was that he wasn't a careless man. The ranch was hard-pressed and somewhat under-resourced, but nothing had been neglected out of laziness. It had been neglected because one person couldn't manage everything at once, and there were clear signs of where he'd made his choices. The horses were in excellent condition. The barn was tight and properly maintained. The fence along the western boundary was better repaired than any other. He'd prioritized what he'd prioritized, and it told her something about what he cared about. On the fifth night, Silas Hale told her, over dinner, a story about his son that she was fairly certain Dawson didn't know he was telling. It was a story about a cattle dispute 15 years ago when Dawson had been 24 and had gone alone to negotiate with a neighboring rancher who had stolen 3 of their animals. The rancher was twice his age and known for being difficult, and Dawson had come home with the cattle and without a scratch because he'd spent 3 hours out there talking until the other man ran out of positions. He doesn't like confrontation for its own sake, Silas said, but he'll stand there all day if he has to. She looked at Silas and then at Dawson, who had the expression of a man who had heard his father tell his stories before and was coexisting with it rather than objecting. I understand, she said, and she was starting to. On the 7th day, which was a Sunday, Dawson found her at the desk in the main room. She'd cleared it, finally, and organized the papers into categories and was writing out a household schedule she'd been developing, and he stood in the doorway for a moment before speaking. You can stay, he said. She set down her pen. Under what terms? He told her. The wages were modest but not insulting. The room was hers. She'd have full authority over household management, and he'd have final say on anything that involved money over a certain amount. That's reasonable, she said. You'll let me know if something's not working. Yes. She paused. There are things in town I'm going to encounter. People will have questions about my being here. People always have questions, he said. That's their business. It might create complications. We've got a land claim coming at us from Granger, he said. That's a real complication. Whatever people in town want to say about the arrangement here is not something I'm spending time on. She looked at him. He was standing in the doorway with his hands in his coat pockets and his expression saying, very clearly, I've given you my answer, and there isn't more. All right, she said. She picked up her pen. He left, and she could hear his boots on the kitchen floor, and then the back door. And then nothing but the wind picking up outside and the wood settling in the stove. And she sat at the desk she'd cleared with its organized stacks of paper and the schedule half written and the household around her in its ordinary winter evening quiet. Mara somewhere upstairs probably not doing what she was supposed to be doing, Lila reading in a way that was entirely deliberate. Silas Hale in his room with his aching joints and his careful letters, and she thought, here, not home. She wasn't ready for that word, and she wasn't sure she believed in it the way people usually meant it. But here was something. Here was a start. She went back to writing the schedule. Outside, the first snow of the season began to fall on the Hale Ranch, quiet and purposeful, covering the frozen ground in something that looked, from the window, almost like beginning. The snow that had started on Sunday night was gone by Tuesday, melted off by an afternoon of thin winter sun that didn't warm anything but at least showed up. What it left behind was mud, and mud on a working ranch was its own particular problem. It got into everything, tracked through the kitchen on boot soles, made the path between the house and barn something you navigated rather than walked. Evelyn put down a strip of burlap from the back door to the porch steps, which helped some, and instituted a boot-scraping requirement that Mara resisted and Lila adopted immediately, and Silas observed with the expression of a man acknowledging a sound idea without wanting to say so out loud. Dawson said nothing about the burlap. He just used it. That was how the arrangement worked in those early weeks. quietly, through action rather than declaration. Evelyn managed, and he noticed, and neither of them made a performance of it. She reorganized the supply cupboard and made a running list of what needed replenishing before serious winter arrived. She developed a Tuesday bread routine that produced 4 loaves, 2 for the week, and 2 that could go into the cold box. She started sitting with Mara in the evenings to go over her arithmetic, not as a teacher exactly, but as someone who could sit next to a 9-year-old and work through problems without making the 9-year-old feel supervised, a distinction that mattered enormously to Mara, who had very specific ideas about her own competence. Leela remained watchful. She was polite in the way that intelligent, cautious children are polite, functionally, without commitment. She helped with chores without being asked twice. She set the table and cleared it. She answered questions directly and didn't ask many in return. Evelyn did not push. It was Silas who told her, on a gray Wednesday morning when they were the only 2 in the house, Dawson out at the east fence, the girls at school in town, what Lila's particular difficulty was. She was 10 when her mother died, he said. He was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee he'd been nursing for the better part of an hour, his hands wrapped around it for the warmth. She remembers enough to compare. Evelyn was at the stove, reducing the bones from Sunday's roast into stock. She stirred and said nothing, letting him go at his own pace. Clara was the kind of woman who ran the household the way Dawson runs the fence line. She knew every inch. Lila learned the house from her. A pause. When Clara passed, Lila started running things herself. She was 10 years old and she was doing the laundry and keeping track of the stores. Dawson didn't ask her to. She just started. And then someone new arrived, Evelyn said. You see the problem? I do. She considered. I'm not trying to replace what she built. No. Silas's gray eyes were steady on her. But she doesn't know that yet. It was useful, that information. Not because it changed what she did, but because it clarified why Lila watched her the way she did. The girl was not hostile. She was assessing whether what Evelyn was doing was addition or erasure. That was a reasonable thing to assess. Evelyn made a point, the following week, of asking Lila about the household systems that were already in place before she'd arrived, which shelves held what, how the laundry had been organized, what the winter stores list had looked like. She wrote down what Lila told her, with Lila watching, and she kept the parts that were working, and she changed the parts that weren't, and she told Lila specifically which was which and why. Lila didn't say much during those conversations, but she stopped watching Evelyn from across rooms and started occasionally being in the same room without an obvious reason for it, which was, Evelyn understood, a considerable shift. It was slow work, not dramatic, just the patient, unremarkable accumulation of small, reliable things. Yeah, the first time Evelyn went into Black Creek since her arrival at the ranch, she went for supplies on a Thursday, riding in the wagon with Pete, who had warmed to her approximately 3 degrees over the course of the past 2 weeks, which, in Pete terms, was significant. She needed lamp oil, salt, a new tin bucket for the laundry, and 2 items Silas had requested from the apothecary. The town received her with the particular attention of a small community that had already processed her existence and developed opinions about it. She felt it immediately, the slight pause in conversation at the dry goods counter when she came in, the way the woman behind the counter, a solid, efficient person named Helen, was friendly enough but clearly processing multiple things at once. The awareness of being looked at, not maliciously, just thoroughly. She did the shopping without incident and was carrying 2 parcels toward the wagon when she encountered the first direct version of what she'd been sensing. The woman was standing outside the milliner's, well-dressed in the way of someone who wanted you to know it without appearing to try. Her name, Evelyn learned later, was Margot Vance, wife of the local land assessor, which meant something in a town where land was the primary currency. She had the kind of face that had been pretty once and had curdled somewhere along the way into something sharper and more deliberate. "You're the woman at the Hale Ranch," she said. Not a question. "I manage their household," Evelyn said. She kept walking, just slightly, making it clear she wasn't stopping but wasn't being rude. A fine calibration. Margot Vance made the sound with the specific weight of a woman storing information for later use. "Dawson Hale is raising children." "He is," Evelyn said. "A man in his situation." The pause was architectural. "People do wonder." Evelyn stopped. She looked at Margot Vance with a calm she had developed over years of dealing with exactly this kind of conversation, the kind that attacked sideways, with implication rather than statement, so the speaker could deny intent if pressed. "People are welcome to wonder," she said. "The Hale household is a working ranch with 2 children, an elderly man, and a great deal of practical work. That's what I do, the practical work." "Of course," Margot Vance said pleasantly. Evelyn continued to the wagon. She told Dawson about the exchange that evening at dinner, not to create drama, but because she'd told him she'd let him know if something came up that might create complications, and this qualified. She stated it plainly, the same way she'd state a fence problem or a supply shortage. He was quiet for a moment. Silas was looking at his plate. The girls had eaten early and were in the other room. "Margot Vance," he said. "I don't know her well enough to have an opinion." "Her husband processes land assessments," Dawson said. "He and Granger have had dealings." He said it the way he said most things, evenly, without visible heat, but she was learning to read the level underneath the evenness. "It's not coincidental that she's asking about our household." Evelyn considered this. "She's gathering information." "Or planting it." Silas set it to his plate. "What kind of claim is Granger making?" she asked. It was the first time she'd asked directly. She'd known about it since the notice board, but she'd waited. Dawson looked at her. "Eastern pasture. He's claiming his grandfather's deed covers it. Says the original survey was wrong." He paused. "It wasn't wrong. I have the original Hale survey documents, and they're clear. But clear and legally settled are 2 different things, and Granger has money and he has connections at the territorial office." "Have you spoken with an attorney?" "I'm going to." He said it in the tone that meant he'd been meaning to and hadn't gotten there yet. "There's a man in town," Silas said, "Leland Cross. He does land and property. He's decent." "I know the name," Dawson said. He was looking at his food. "I'll go this week." "I can draft a summary of the current situation," Evelyn said. "What you know, what documents you have, what the timeline of Granger's claim looks like. It would save you time with Cross and make sure you don't miss anything." Both men looked at her. "It's what I do," she said. "I organize things." Dawson was quiet for a moment. Then, "All right," he said. She spent 2 evenings on the summary. She used the desk in the main room, her desk now, in practical terms, though she never said so, and she wrote 4 pages in a clear, organized hand that laid out what Dawson had told her about the land history, the original survey, Granger's stated claim, and the outstanding questions. She was precise about what she knew and what she was inferring, and she made the distinction clear on the page. Dawson read it at breakfast on Saturday. He read it carefully, the way Silas had read her reference letters, actually reading, not skimming. When he finished, he set it down and looked at it for a moment. "You didn't miss anything," he said. "I may have. I don't know the land as well as you do, but this gives you a starting point with Cross." "I know." A pause. "Where did you learn to write like this?" She considered the question. "I wrote letters for a merchant in Missouri for 2 years. He had a lot of situations that needed to be explained clearly to people who didn't want to understand them." Something crossed his face, not quite a smile, but adjacent to one. "That's useful," he said. "I know." He met with Leland Cross the following week. He came home with a look that was not quite reassured and not quite alarmed, which was probably about the right response to anything an attorney told you about a land dispute. He told her that evening that Cross thought the Hale position was defensible, but that a formal territorial survey review would strengthen it considerably. That took money and time, both of which were in limited supply. "There may be a way to request an expedited review," she said. "If the original boundary documents are strong, I'd want to look at them." He looked at her. "Why?" "Because I've looked at enough land and property correspondence to know what matters in that kind of document and what doesn't. I might see something useful. Or I might not, and then I've just spent an evening looking at old papers, which isn't the worst thing." He thought about this for a moment. She could see him working through the part of him that was private about ranch business and the part of him that was practical, and watching the practical part make its case. "They're in the lockbox in the study," he said. "I'll get them out tomorrow." The papers were 40 years old in some cases. The original Hale land grant, the subsequent survey, the water rights documentation that ran alongside the property boundary. They were carefully preserved, which told her something about how the Hale family thought about the land. She spread them on the kitchen table on a Sunday morning when the house was quiet, Dawson out, girls still asleep, Silas not yet up, and she read them slowly, taking notes. The original survey map was detailed, done by a man named Cartwright in the territory's early settlement days. It was precise in the way that good surveyors were precise. Coordinates, bearing lines, natural landmarks used as reference points. The eastern boundary ran along a line described as the creek bed and continuation thereof to the northern ridge, and the map showed this clearly. She studied the bearing notation and made a note. She was on her third cup of coffee and her second page of notes when Lila appeared in the kitchen doorway in her nightgown, hair loose. "It's early," Lila said. "I'm a morning person," Evelyn said. "Come in if you want. I'm just looking at papers." Lila came in and looked at the spread of documents on the table. Her eyes moved over them with the focused attention of someone who knew these papers existed and had probably looked at them before. "These are from the lockbox," she said. "Your father said I could look at them." Lila sat down across from her, tucking her feet up on the chair in a way that she probably wouldn't have done if she'd been more awake. She looked at the survey map. "Mama showed me this once," she said. "She said it was the proof of our land." She was right. Evelyn slid the map a few inches so Lila could see it better. "This line here is the eastern boundary, the creek." Lila looked. "Granger says it's further in. He says a lot of things." She looked at the map. "But the survey says something specific. This mark here," she pointed, "is a bearing notation. It tells you which direction the boundary line runs. If you match it to the natural landmarks listed here, the creek isn't on Granger's land. It's on your land's edge." Lila was quiet for a moment, studying the map with the same careful attention she gave most things. "Can you prove that? Not by myself, but a surveyor can. And this document gives a surveyor exactly what they need to confirm it." She looked at Lila. "Your mother was right to call this the proof." Something shifted in Lila's face. Not dramatically, not a sudden warmth or a complete surrender of her caution. Just a small, precise movement, the way a door settles into its frame. "She'd have liked you," Lila said, and then looked slightly surprised at herself for saying it. Evelyn didn't make more of it than it was. "That's a good thing to hear," she said simply. "Do you want coffee? There's enough in the pot." "I'm 13. I started at 12, but you can say no." Lila almost smiled. "I'll have some," she said. And then after a moment, "Don't tell Papa." But winter was establishing itself seriously by mid-December. The cold came in from the north with real intention, and Evelyn started keeping the kitchen fire going later into the night and watching the sky in the mornings with the attention of someone learning to read a language she didn't yet fully speak. She'd lived in cold climates before, but this was a different kind of cold, horizontal and committed, the kind that arrived with wind and stayed. Dawson started checking on the horses more frequently, which she noticed because she noticed things, and she noticed he was doing it without particular comment or alarm, which meant it was routine rather than worry. But it was a particular attentiveness, the kind that preceded action, and she filed it. She was starting to understand his rhythms. He was up before the house, always. He checked the sky first thing, before coffee even. She'd caught him at it twice, standing just outside the back door for a moment, looking north. He ate efficiently and without complaint about food, which made cooking for him uncomplicated. He talked more at dinner than at other times, which she suspected had to do with the fact that dinner was the one place he stopped moving. He asked the girls questions about their schooling that were specific. Not how was school, but what did you work on, and what did Mrs. Garrow say about that, which told her how he thought about things. He wanted the concrete version. He asked her once in early December how she'd ended up doing this kind of work. The managing, the organizing. They were in the kitchen after the girls had gone upstairs, and Silas had retired early, and it was the quiet hour that the house had developed almost without anyone deciding on it. "I was good at it," she said, "and it was portable." Portable. "I needed work I could take with me. I moved a lot." She poured herself more coffee and offered the pot. He declined. Household management can go wherever there are households. "Why did you move?" She considered how much of the actual answer to give him. "I had a position in Badley in Ohio," she said. "The family wanted someone who'd stay in her lane, and I didn't always manage that. Then I went to Pittsburgh, and that was better, and then Missouri, and Kansas City. She paused. I was good at each position. I just wasn't good at being the kind of person some people wanted me to be. He was quiet for a moment. What kind is that? Smaller, she said. Less present. He looked at her with an expression that was thoughtful and a little tired, the look of a man at the end of a long day who is still paying attention. That seems like the wrong thing to want, he said. Most people don't do it deliberately, she said. They just want their household to run and their decisions to be the ones that stand. And yours would have conflicted. Sometimes they had better outcomes. She said it without apology. That was the problem. He was quiet for a bit, looking at the table. My wife had better ideas than me sometimes, he said. It came out carefully. He'd been considering whether to say it. I learned to hear them better over time. Took a while. She didn't comment on that. She let it sit where he'd put it. Some things didn't need a response, they just needed to be received. The survey papers, she said after a moment. I'd like to write to the Territorial Survey Office. There may be a way to request a formal review on the basis of the original document. I can make the argument in writing. He looked at her. You think they'd respond? I think a clear, organized request based on specific document evidence is harder to ignore than a general complaint, but I'd want to show it to Cross before I send it. You're taking this on, he said. You've got enough to manage, she said. The fence, the horses, the winter supplies. Let me manage this. He was quiet for a moment. In the silence, she could hear the wind picking up outside, moving against the eaves in the way it did out here. Not gusting exactly, but pressing, a sustained pressure that would be there when they woke up and would probably still be there at noon. All right, he said. It was the same 2 words he'd used when she'd said she could come out to the ranch, and when she'd offered to draft the situation summary, and she was beginning to understand that for him, those 2 words represented a degree of trust that he didn't extend quickly or lightly. She went to bed that night with the wind pressing at the window glass and a legal letter taking shape in her head, and she lay there in the narrow room with the east-facing window and thought about the survey map spread on the kitchen table that morning, and Lila saying she'd have liked you with that expression of private surprise. She wasn't sentimental about it. She didn't let herself be. But she held it for a moment before the cold and the wind and the day's exhaustion pulled her down into sleep, and that felt like its own kind of acknowledgement, that some things were worth noticing, even if you were too careful to say so. Outside, the wind kept at it, and the ranch kept its ground, and in the eastern pasture the boundary line ran exactly where the old survey said it ran, patient and precise, waiting to be confirmed. The letter to the Territorial Survey Office went out on a Tuesday, carried by the mail rider who came through Black Creek every 10 days and treated his route with the particular devotion of a man who had decided his work mattered and intended to prove it by never being late. Evelyn had rewritten the letter 3 times before she was satisfied, and she'd shown the final version to Leland Cross on a Thursday morning when Dawson had driven her into town for supplies and waited in the wagon while she walked the 2 blocks to Cross's office and let herself in without being announced, which Cross had apparently not expected. He was a compact man in his mid-50s with a careful desk and the manner of someone who had learned that people came to him when they were afraid and had developed a way of being calm that didn't dismiss the fear but didn't amplify it either. He read her letter without speaking, and then read it again, which she was beginning to understand was a compliment in professional circles. "This is well organized," he said. "I know." She sat across from him with her hands folded and waited. "You've cited the original bearing notation here." He tapped the page. "That's the right move. The survey office will be looking for whether the claim has documentary basis, and this tells them exactly where to look." "Can they move faster if the request is clear?" "They can move faster if they want to." He set the letter down. "Whether they want to depends on several things, not all of which we control." "Granger has connections at the Territorial office," she said. "That's what Dawson told me." Cross looked at her steadily. "That's true. Granger has a relationship with the deputy assessor. It doesn't make him invincible, but it means we need to be more thorough than he is, not just equally thorough." "Then we'll be more thorough." She said it plainly, not as bravado, as a statement of intent. "What else does your office need?" He'd looked at her over the desk with an expression that was somewhere between professional appreciation and mild surprise. And he told her 3 things she could do to strengthen the request, and she'd written them down, and she'd gone back to the wagon and told Dawson what Cross had said. Dawson had listened with his eyes on the road ahead. He thinks we can win it? He thinks we have a strong position if we do the work correctly. Those aren't the same thing, but the second one is the part we control. He was quiet for a moment. You went in there and talked to him like you do the accounts. That's how it should be talked about. She adjusted her coat against the wind coming over the wagon. It's a document problem. Documents have answers if you look at them the right way. He didn't say anything else on the road home, but when they pulled up to the ranch and she climbed down from the wagon, he said, before she'd gotten to the porch steps, "Thank you, Evelyn." She turned. He was still on the wagon seat, hands on the reins, not looking at her but looking slightly past her, which was what he did when he was saying something that cost him something. "It's the work," she said, and went inside. December deepened. The cold wasn't polite about it. By the second week, the temperature had dropped far enough that Evelyn could see her breath in the kitchen until the stove had been going for a full half hour, and the pump in the yard froze twice, requiring hot water and patience to get moving again. She added a morning routine of checking the pump before anything else, which Mara found fascinating and insisted on helping with until the third morning when her hands got cold and she decided against further involvement. Silas Hale's joints were giving him more trouble. He moved more slowly through the mornings, and she learned to have his coffee at the table before he was fully through the door, and to not comment on how long it took him to sit down. He had a particular pride that was architectural. It held the structure of him upright, and she wasn't going to chip at it by making his difficulties visible. She ordered an additional jar of liniment from the apothecary on the next supply run and left it on the shelf in his room without discussion, and when it disappeared from the shelf, she knew it was being used. The girls had a 2-week break from town school over Christmas. Lila spent most of it reading and doing, as far as Evelyn could tell, a private project that involved a considerable amount of paper and a level of secrecy that she respected by not inquiring about. Mara spent most of it asking questions. She asked Evelyn about Ohio, about Pittsburgh, about what Missouri was like, about whether she'd ever seen a river flood, about whether she could braid hair, about what she thought of Silas's liniment smell, which Mara described as strong but not bad, more like something you'd put on a fence than a person. "Mara," Lila said. "It's not rude, I like it," Mara said. "It smells like the barn but warmer." "That's not better," Lila said. Evelyn braided Mara's hair that evening. The girl sat still for exactly as long as required and no longer, and thought about how the household had shifted around her in the past month. Not dramatically, not like a story with a turning point you could point to. More like soil settling after rain, finding the arrangement it would hold. Dawson was not easy company. She wanted to be accurate about that. He was not warm in the way some people were warm, freely, automatically, the heat available to whoever came close. His warmth was specific and came slowly, and you had to earn it by being reliable. And even then he kept parts of himself at a distance that she recognized was probably the shape grief had left in him, and possibly the shape he'd always been. And she didn't know which, and wasn't sure it mattered. What she knew was that he was honest, and that he was capable of saying I was wrong when he was, which was rarer than it should have been in her experience. She'd heard him say it to Pete about something to do with the fence post repair, and to Silas about a grain storage decision, and both times with the same flat, unsentimental delivery that suggested he treated being wrong as a piece of information to work with rather than a thing to be survived. She found that quality more interesting than most of his other ones, which were also considerable. She did not examine this finding closely. She had work to do. Rafe Granger came to the ranch on the 18th of December. She was in the kitchen when the riders came up the track, 2 men on horseback, one of them significantly larger than any practical reason required, and the other one riding ahead slightly in the way of a man who was accustomed to arriving places and having the arrival mean something. She looked out the window and recognized, from Dawson's description and her own reading of the land claim documents, that the second man was probably Granger himself. She went to the back door and called across the yard. "Dawson." Her voice was level, not alarmed, but she put enough in it that he came out of the barn within moments. He saw the riders and walked toward the yard gate without hurrying, which she respected. She stayed on the porch. Rafe Granger was perhaps 50, built in the wide-shouldered way of men who had been physical in their youth, and retained the frame, if not all the original content. He had a full mustache and a good coat, and the expression of a man who considered his own time more valuable than most other people's by default, and only occasionally revised this view. Hail, he said, from horseback, which told you something. Granger. Dawson stood just inside the gate with his hands in his coat pockets. Get down if you want to talk. A small pause, the kind where a man decides whether to let himself be directed. Granger got down. I heard you've been in contact with the survey office, he said. I have. I'm going to tell you something out of... He searched for the word. Consideration. Man to man. You're not going to win this claim. The deputy assessor has reviewed the petition and he's leaning toward upholding it. You can spend your money on cross and your time on letters, but the result is going to be the same. Then why are you here? Dawson said. He said it without heat, but there was something in his stillness that Evelyn had come to recognize as his version of warning. Because I'd rather resolve this without a formal process. Granger's voice modulated toward something approaching reasonable. I'll buy the eastern pasture at fair assessment value. You get cash, I get the land. Nobody goes through a territorial review that could take 2 years and cost both of us considerable. The eastern pasture isn't for sale. Hail. It's not for sale, Dawson said. Not at assessment value, not at any value. It's Hale land, and it's going to stay Hale land. He said it the way he said most things, evenly, without the performance of anger, which somehow made it more final than anger would have been. You're welcome to pursue your claim through the proper process. That's your right. But we're not settling outside it. Granger looked at him for a moment. Then he looked at the house and at Evelyn on the porch, and his gaze settled on her with a particular quality that she recognized, the look of a man adding information to a picture he was constructing. You're the woman managing the household, he said. Yes, she said. You wrote that letter to the survey office? I helped with correspondence, yes. His expression did something complicated, not hostile exactly, more like a recalculation. That was a thorough letter. Thank you, she said, with the same tone she'd used to acknowledge a comment about the weather. He looked at Dawson again. You're going to spend money you don't have on a process that won't go your way. Then we'll see each other in the process, Dawson said. Granger reset his hat. He got back on his horse, which was a well-maintained animal that suggested he spent money on the right things. He looked at the property for a moment. The house, the outbuildings, the fence line, the eastern pasture visible in the distance as a flat white field under the December sky, with the look of a man calculating worth. Don't let a woman's enthusiasm cost you your land, Hale, he said, and turned his horse and rode back down the track with his large companion behind him. The yard was quiet. Dawson stood at the gate for a moment, not moving, and she watched the set of his shoulders and knew he was doing what he did, working through it before he said anything. He turned and came back toward the house, and when he reached the porch, he stopped and looked at her. You all right? I'm fine. She was. He's testing the resistance before he commits to his strategy. That's what that was. I know. A pause. He's not wrong that the deputy assessor is connected to him. He's also not wrong that a formal process is expensive. She held his gaze. But the alternative is giving up land that's yours. Yes. He said it without drama. So we do the process. He went inside. She stayed on the porch for a moment longer, looking down the track where the riders had gone, the hoof prints still visible in the frozen mud, and she thought about Granger's last comment and what it was designed to do, which was to introduce a wedge between Dawson's judgment and hers, to make him second-guess whether her help was helping or hurting. It was a specific kind of tactic, and she'd seen it before. It worked on men who were uncertain of themselves, or who needed other people's approval more than they needed their own conviction. She didn't think it would work on Dawson Hale, but she was going to pay attention. The storm came the week before the new year, and it came the way the worst weather always does, with a full day's warning that made you think you were ready, and then arrived worse than you'd prepared for. The sky on the day before had a particular look, not the iron gray of ordinary winter clouds, but something yellower, lower, with a weight to it that felt like pressure rather than weather. Dawson spent the afternoon moving things. She helped without being asked, the tools from the smaller outbuilding into the barn, the hay stores covered and tied, the horse's water trough checked twice. Silas, moving slowly, brought in extra firewood and stacked it in the kitchen corridor until Evelyn asked him to please stop at 6 armloads because there wasn't room for more, and she needed to be able to walk to the stove. 7, he said, and brought in one more. She let it go. The girls were sent to bed early, which Mara protested, and Lila accepted with the pragmatism of someone who had seen a winter storm before and understood what it meant. Evelyn checked all the windows and stuffed the gaps at the base of the exterior doors with the folded burlap strips she'd been keeping for exactly this purpose, which Dawson noticed and didn't comment on, which was his way of acknowledging good foresight. The storm hit around midnight. She woke to the sound of it, not the wind itself, which she'd heard build during the evening, but a change in the wind, a shift from sustained pressure to something intermittent and violent. She lay for a moment in her narrow bed and listened to the house's response, the walls settling, the window glass vibrating in its frame, the stovepipe making a sound she didn't like but recognized as the storm pulling draft through it, rather than anything structurally wrong. She got up. The kitchen was cold. The fire had banked properly, but the storm was drawing heat from the room faster than normal. She got the fire up and put the kettle on and stood at the kitchen window, which was black with night and moving with snow driven hard against the glass. Dawson was already up. She hadn't heard him, but when she came into the kitchen, he was already in his coat at the back door, not opening it yet, just listening. "Barn door," he said. "I need to check the latch." "The horses, they're inside. I got them in at dusk, but the south latch on the big door has been sticking. If the wind gets under it." He didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. She'd seen the horses. She knew what they represented to the ranch's ability to function. "I'll come with you," she said. "You don't need to." "I know." She was already reaching for her coat. He looked at her for a moment, and then he opened the door. The cold was different out there from any cold she'd experienced before. It wasn't the temperature alone. She'd been cold before, but the wind on top of it, which drove snow horizontally and got into the gap between her collar and her hat and found the area of exposed skin at her wrist between glove and sleeve and focused there with something that felt almost personal. She kept her head down and followed Dawson's shape through the dark, which was not completely dark. The snow itself provided a low, diffuse light that made shapes visible without making anything clear. The barn was 20 yards from the house. In ordinary conditions, she could have walked it in less than a minute. Tonight it took 3 times that, and by the time they reached the barn wall, she could not feel her face properly, and was breathing through her nose because breathing through her mouth let in cold that went straight to the back of her throat. The latch was open. The south door was banging, held only by the interior sliding bar, which was holding but was being tested hard with every gust. Dawson got the external latch secured, using his shoulder against the door to hold it, while he worked the metal, which was stiff with cold and required more force than she'd expected to watch him apply. Inside, the horses were moving, uneasy but contained, and she could hear them, the stamp of hooves, a single high sound from one of the mares that wasn't quite a whinny but was close. The latch held. He tested it twice. The door stopped banging. And then a gust hit that was different from the others. Not a sustained push, but something sudden, a lateral force that struck the door from a different angle and drove it inward hard enough to break the external latch out of its catch and send the door swinging. Dawson got to it first. He had the door by its edge, but the wind was enormous, and he was one person, and it was fighting him. She got her hands on the door next to his, both of them leaning into it, and the cold and the wind and the weight of the thing were all happening at once, and she was aware in a very specific way of the horses behind her, and what would happen if they got out into the storm, and how much that would cost. Not just in money, but in the fundamental ability of the ranch to survive the winter. She braced her boots against the frozen ground and leaned her full weight into the door and held. Her hands went numb within the first minute. She couldn't feel the wood, only the pressure of it, the fact of resistance. She was aware of Dawson beside her, his breathing audible, the close proximity of another person fighting the same thing, and she thought about nothing except keeping her weight against the door, nothing except the 2 inches she could feel giving and then recovering, the wind hunting for the gap and not finding it because she and Dawson were the gap. She didn't know how long it took. Time in that kind of cold and effort did something strange. It stretched and compressed simultaneously. At some point, the gust eased enough for Dawson to get the secondary bar back into its slot, and then the door was held from inside rather than by them, and she could step back. And the relief in her hands was so immediate and so physical that she almost lost her balance. Dawson's arm caught her, just once, briefly, and then she was standing on her own again. "Okay?" he said. He was breathing hard. "Yes." Her voice came out strange. The cold had done something to her lip. Horses? He turned and checked. The horses were where they should be, agitated but unhurt. He moved through them with a quick, sure efficiency, checking each one with a hand to the neck, a check of the feet, talking to them in a low voice that she could hear but not make out the words of. Not words for her anyway, just the sound a person makes when they're reassuring something that can't be reasoned with but can be calmed. When he turned back, she had her hands under her arms and was doing a systematic inventory of whether she still had feeling in all her fingers. She did, mostly. The cold had a delayed quality to it. The real pain came when you got back inside and the warmth returned. He came toward her and stood close, not touching, but close in the way that you stood close to another person when you were in the dark, and the barn was loud with wind, and you needed to speak without shouting. "We need to get the second latch braced," he said. "There's a length of timber in the back." They found the timber, a solid 6-foot piece that she helped him maneuver into position as a brace across the door from inside. It was heavy and awkward and required more coordination between them than she'd expected, neither of them able to see the other's face clearly in the dim light from the lantern Dawson had thought to bring, and she hadn't, which she noted for the future. They got it braced and tested it again. The barn held. The wind kept trying, and the barn held. On the walk back to the house, she could feel the storm in every part of her body. Not as cold so much anymore as a kind of ringing, the physical memory of effort. Dawson pushed the back door open, and she went in ahead of him, and the warmth of the kitchen hit her face with something close to violence. Her cheeks felt like they were on fire. Her hands, as the blood returned to them, sent up a signal she could only describe as objection. Silas was in the kitchen, sitting at the table with a lamp and his cup of coffee, and the look of a man who had been awake, and had known something was happening and had made his peace with not being out in it. "Latch," he said. "Braced," Dawson said. He was already getting out of his coat. Silas looked at Evelyn. He looked at her carefully, the way he did when he was assessing something he hadn't decided how to respond to yet. Then he said, "Sit down. I'll get coffee." She sat. She wrapped both hands around the mug when it came and said nothing, and Silas said nothing, and Dawson came back and sat across from her and also said nothing. And they three sat in the warm kitchen while the storm ran at the house from the outside, and the wood in the stove made the sounds of steady, reliable combustion. After a while, Silas said, "You held that door." "We held it," she said. "He's bigger than you." "The door was bigger than both of us," she said. "Physics doesn't care about size." Silas made the noise she'd come to recognize as his version of a laugh. Dawson looked at her across the table with an expression that was difficult to read in the lamplight. Or maybe it wasn't difficult and she was choosing to treat it as such. She drank her coffee and her hands hurt, and the storm continued, and she was very, very tired. By morning the storm had passed, which it did with the abrupt indifference of weather that doesn't have reasons, just conditions. The world outside was white and still, and the snow had drifted against the north side of every structure in a way that was going to require serious work. The horses were fine. The barn had held. A section of fencing on the western side was down, and the kitchen garden stone edging had been moved in 3 places. But these were manageable problems. The household was quiet at breakfast in the way things were quiet after something difficult had been gotten through. A working quiet, not an uncomfortable one. Mara, who had slept through the entire storm with the depth of sleep particular to children and clear consciences, was disappointed and said so at length. "I didn't get to help," she said. "You help by not being in the way," Silas told her. "That's not helping, that's just not being a problem." "Sometimes that's the most valuable thing you can do," Evelyn said. Mara looked unconvinced but accepted it provisionally. The aftermath of the storm, though, brought its own complications, and they came not from the weather, but from the town. Word traveled in small communities the way water traveled on flat ground, finding every available path without apparent effort. By the following Thursday, when Evelyn went in for supplies with Pete, she knew from the quality of Helen's greeting at the dry goods store and the particular angle of 2 other women's attention near the milliner's that something was circulating. She found out what it was from Mrs. Pell, who she stopped to see because she'd promised to return a book she'd borrowed, and who told her over a cup of tea in the boarding house parlor with the directness that was her primary social gift. "Margot Vance has been talking," Mrs. Pell said. "She's saying the arrangement at the Hale Ranch is..." She selected the word carefully. "Unsuitable." For the girls. Evelyn set her cup down. Unsuitable how? She's implying that a single man and a single woman living under the same roof sends a message that's not appropriate where children are concerned. Mrs. Pell looked at her steadily. She's also suggesting your interest in the land claim is not purely professional. The room was quiet. Outside, the main street went about its business with the particular sound of a small town after a storm, voices and wagon wheels and the distant clang of the smithy. She's trying to destabilize the household, Evelyn said. She's trying to create a situation where Dawson feels pressure from the community to change the arrangement. Mrs. Pell was precise about it, which would leave the land claim work in a less organized state than it's currently in. This is connected to Granger. Margot's husband and Granger have mutual interests. That's been true for 2 years. She paused. I'm not a gossip. I know, Evelyn said. I'm telling you because you need to know, not so you'll do something dramatic. I'm not a dramatic person, Evelyn said. Mrs. Pell looked at her with the expression of someone who had enough information to form an opinion and the self-discipline to keep it in place. Dawson Hale is a good man in a hard spot, she said. He doesn't have many people in his corner. He has his father, Evelyn said, and his daughters. Yes. She picked up her own cup. And recently, it seems, one more. This aside Minnesam. She told Dawson that evening. She told him the way she told him everything, clearly, without softening the relevant parts, because softened information was less useful than accurate information, and she'd made herself a promise not to manage him. He listened with his eyes on the table and his expression doing the thing it did, that surface stillness that was covering active processing underneath. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Vance, he said. Yes. Her husband has been involved in 3 land assessments in this county in the past 4 years, he said. 2 of them went to buyers with connections to Granger's operation. She looked at him. You know this. Cross told me. Last week. He looked up at her. I didn't tell you because I didn't have the full picture yet. She accepted this. It was reasonable. He was learning, same as she was, how much to share and when. Does Cross think we can bring it into the review process, the assessor's connection to Granger? He thinks it's relevant if we can document it. It changes the character of the claim from a legitimate boundary dispute to something that's being manipulated through official channels. He paused. That's a different kind of fight. It's still a document problem, she said. It just has more documents. He looked at her across the table, the dinner things still between them, the lamp giving the kitchen its evening quality, the house quiet with Silas and the girls already settled. You're not worried about what Vance is saying. In town. She considered how honest to be. She settled on fully honest, because she always did eventually. I'm aware of it, she said. It doesn't change what I'm doing here, but I understand if it creates difficulties for you. It doesn't, he said. He said it simply, without the weight of someone making a declaration. Just a fact, delivered the way he delivered facts. She looked at him for a moment. The lamp between them made his face look different than it did in daylight, less composed, maybe, or composed in a different way. Your girls are going to hear things, she said, if they haven't already. Lila will handle it, he said. She handles most things. She shouldn't have to handle things she's 13 years old for, Evelyn said, and the slight edge in her voice surprised even her a little. Dawson looked at her. No, he said after a moment. She shouldn't. She stood up and began clearing the table, and he stood up and helped, which he'd taken to doing over the past few weeks without comment, passing dishes to her at the wash basin, and neither of them spoke. And outside the night was clear and cold after the storm, and the eastern pasture sat in the dark exactly where it had always been, bounded by the creek and the ridge, patient and precise, waiting for the world to sort out what was true. The new year arrived in Black Creek without ceremony, which suited the people who lived there. There was no gathering in the square, no celebration that Evelyn was aware of, just the sense that January had replaced December the way one stone replaced another in a fence repair, functionally, necessarily, without drama. She woke on the first morning of the year with frost on the inside of her window glass and a list forming in her head before she was fully conscious, which told her something about where she'd gotten to. The list was about the documents. Cross had given her a clearer picture of what the territorial review process required, and she'd spent the last days of December going through the Hale family papers with more systematic attention than her first pass had allowed. There was more there than she'd initially seen, not just the original survey and the land grant, but letters, receipts, a record of fence construction from 12 years ago that established exactly where the Hale family had treated the boundary as running, which was a different kind of evidence than a survey document, but not an unimportant one. Behavior over time. The fence had stood where the family understood the line to be, and the fence was documented. She'd found the fence construction record in a box that had been stored on the upper shelf of the study, a box Dawson hadn't opened since his wife's death, from the look of the dust on it. Inside were Clara Hale's household records, kept in a hand that was rounder and more fluid than Evelyn's own, and they were meticulous. Clara had recorded everything: supply purchases, medical expenses, correspondence sent and received, visitors to the ranch, significant weather events, and crucially, a running account of any work done on the property lines. The fence construction was recorded over 3 separate entries across 2 summers, with exact dates and the names of the 2 men who'd been hired to help with the work. Evelyn had sat at the kitchen table with those records for a long time the evening she'd found them. She had not opened the box without asking Dawson first. She'd knocked on the door of the small study and told him what she'd found and asked whether she could look through it. And he'd been quiet for a moment and then said yes, and she'd known from his face that it cost him something, and she'd taken the box without making more of it than it was. She read Clara's entries with the focused attention of someone looking for evidence, but she was aware of the other quality of what she was reading, the way a person's system of record-keeping revealed their mind. Clara Hale had been organized, precise, and occasionally funny. There was an entry from a summer 7 years ago that noted a particular horse's escape from the corral and subsequent recovery, described in a single dry sentence. The mare went east again. Dawson retrieved her. She seemed unrepentant. Evelyn had sat with that for a moment before turning the page, aware of something not quite definable. The presence of a person she'd never met who had clearly loved the things she loved and managed the things she managed, and who had documented her fence line because she understood that the land was worth knowing precisely. She'd shown the construction records to Leland Cross at their first meeting of the new year, and Cross had looked at them the way a man looks at something he'd hoped to find but hadn't expected. "These are significant," he said. "I thought so." The dates established consistent usage of the boundary line well before Granger's grandfather's supposed claim. He looked up from the records. "Where did you find these?" "Household accounts." Clara Hale kept thorough records. Something crossed his face that was not quite a smile but was in the same neighborhood. "She did," he said. He'd known the family, she realized. Not closely, but in the way that people in small territories knew each other, across enough years and enough dealings that names and faces connected to histories. "There are also 2 names here," she said. "The men who helped with the fence work. One of them is a Pete Dunmore, who I believe is still working at the ranch. You want to formalize Pete's account. He was there. He knows where the fence was built. A signed statement to that effect, attached to the original construction record. That's a human witness to go with the documentary evidence." She paused. "Cross, I want to ask you something directly." "Go ahead." "How connected is Robert Vance to Granger, specifically?" Cross looked at her over the records. He had the expression of a man deciding how much a client needed to know versus what they could productively do with what they knew. "More connected than is appropriate for a man in his position," he said. "Is there a record of it?" "Possibly." He was careful. "Land assessment records are public. If you know what to look for, which assessments involved properties that subsequently changed hands to buyers with Granger connections, the pattern is there. But patterns aren't proof." "They are if you have enough of them and they're consistent," she said. "Patterns in documented public records are exactly the kind of evidence a territorial review board takes seriously." Cross looked at her for a long moment. "You've thought about this carefully." "I've had time." "You'd need to go through the assessment records at the registry office. That's public access, but it's not organized for easy cross-referencing. It would take several days." "I have several days," she said. "I'll need you to tell me what I'm looking for." He told her. She wrote it down, as she wrote everything, in the small notebook she'd taken to carrying in her coat pocket. She told Dawson that evening what she intended to do, and for the first time since she'd been at the ranch, he pushed back. "That's 3 or 4 days in town," he said, "going through the registry records." Yes? Alone. I'm 31, she said. I've been traveling alone for 10 years. That's not what I... He stopped. Started again. That's not what I mean. The registry office is where Robert Vance works. Yes. You're going to walk in there and start pulling assessment records to document his connection to the man who's claiming our land. That's the plan. He sat back in his chair and looked at her with an expression that was somewhere between admiration and concern, which she found was actually a combination she recognized on his face now, which told her how much ground they'd covered since December. He'll know what you're doing, Dawson said, almost certainly. And that doesn't worry you. It would worry me more not to do it, she said. If the connection between Vance and Granger is documentable through public records, we need to document it. Not documenting it because it might make Vance uncomfortable doesn't serve you. He was quiet. He had his hands flat on the table, a posture she'd come to recognize as him working through something he'd already half decided but wanted to be thorough about. You could be making things difficult for yourself in this town, he said, after everything that's already been said. People can think what they choose, she said. That's always been true. She met his eyes. Dawson, the connection between Vance and Granger is your best argument that this claim isn't a legitimate boundary dispute. It's manipulation using official channels. That's a different thing in the eyes of a review board, and you need it documented. He held her gaze for a moment. How many days? 3, probably. Maybe 4. I'll stay at the Meridian. A pause. I'll tell Mrs. Pell you're coming. I can tell her myself. I know you can, he said. I'll tell her anyway. The Meridian was the same as she'd left it. Same cedar and wool smell in the room, same window onto the neighboring wall. Mrs. Pell had the room ready when Evelyn arrived, and on the table she'd put a pot of tea and not said anything about it, which was her version of a welcome. The registry office opened at 8 in the morning. Robert Vance was behind the main desk when she came in, a compact sandy-haired man with the precise manner of someone who dealt in official documentation and had internalized its rhythms. He knew who she was. She saw it in the 2-second delay before he arranged his expression. Miss Hart, he said, what brings you in? Brings you. I'd like to access the public land assessment records, she said, for the past 5 years. I understand that's public access. It is. He said it without visible reaction, but there was something in the quality of his stillness that told her he'd understood immediately what this was. The records are in the back room, arranged by year and then by filing date. A pause. They're not cross-indexed. I know, she said. I'll manage. The back room was cold and smelled of paper and dust, and the particular institutional odor of a place that processed a great deal of information without being asked to understand it. The records were bound in quarterly volumes, labeled on the spine in a hand that varied by whoever had been doing the filing that year. She found the table in the middle of the room and sat down and started with the current year and worked backward. She worked for 6 hours the first day. She was systematic. She went through every assessment involving properties that had subsequently changed hands, noted the buyer, noted any recorded relationship between buyer and seller or buyer and neighboring properties. She made no assumptions. She wrote down what the record said and what they implied separately, in 2 columns, and let the columns tell their own story. By the end of the first day, she had 7 assessments that warranted closer attention. 3 of them involved properties that had subsequently passed to buyers with documented Granger connections, either Granger himself or entities whose registration listed addresses connected to Granger's holdings. All 3 assessments had been conducted by Robert Vance personally. All 3 had been assessed at values that were, compared to neighboring properties assessed by other officials in the same period, roughly 15 to 20% below market indication. Undervalued assessments made sales easier. Undervalued assessments in contested territory made boundary claims cheaper to pursue. She wrote this down in the implication column and underlined it. Vance came to the doorway of the back room at 4 o'clock. He stood there for a moment without speaking, the way people did when they wanted you to notice them without initiating the conversation. She looked up. Finding everything useful? He said. The records are well maintained, she said, for the most part. He came in a few steps, which she found interesting. He was choosing to engage rather than withdraw, which meant he'd decided that watching her work was more dangerous than being present for it. You're looking for something specific, he said. I'm looking at assessment patterns, she said, for a land review proceeding. Hale's case. Yes. He looked at her without apparent hostility, more with the expression of a man who has considered his own position and is fairly confident in it. Assessment values are based on established methodology, he said. If you find variations, they'll reflect legitimate differences in property condition, access, and comparable sales. I'm sure they will, she said, or they'll reflect something else. I won't know until I've looked at all of them. She held his gaze. That's the point of looking. He stood there for another moment. Then he said, "We close at 5, and left. She worked until 5. She came back the next morning at 8 and worked until 4, and on the second day she found the 4th assessment, a property adjacent to one of the 3 already flagged, assessed by Vance's deputy rather than Vance himself, but at the same anomalous value, and the buyer in this case was a company whose registration she found, after another hour's work, was filed at an address in the same county as Granger's primary holding. 4 assessments, all below market, all involving properties that had passed to Granger-connected buyers, all assessed by Vance or his office. That was a pattern that would stand up in front of a review board as pattern, not coincidence. She brought everything to Cross on the evening of the second day. He read through her notes at his desk and didn't speak for a long time, and when he did, it was a single word spoken to the pages rather than to her. "Good," he said. "Is it enough?" "It's a strong foundation," he said. "I'll need to prepare a formal summary with the specific record citations. That'll take a few days." He looked up. "This is going to make Vance uncomfortable." "I understand that." "And Granger?" "Yes." "You're not concerned about what that might mean for you?" She looked at him. "I'm an employee of the Hale Ranch," she said. "What it means for me is whatever it means for Dawson's case. That's not a separate concern." Cross looked at her steadily for a moment. He had the expression of a man revising a picture he'd been holding. "All right," he said. "I'll have the summary prepared. Can you return to Cross's on Friday?" "I'll be here Friday morning." She stayed a third night at the Meridian because there were 2 more assessment volumes she wanted to verify. Not because she thought she'd find more, but because she wanted to be sure she hadn't missed anything, and she was constitutionally unable to leave a task half-confirmed. Mrs. Pell, on the 3rd evening, brought her tea without being asked, and sat down across from her in the small parlor with her own cup and said, "People are talking." "About the registry work?" "About the registry work, and about you generally." She held her cup in both hands. "Some of it is not kind." "Margot Vance," Evelyn said. "Margot Vance and others who follow her lead." Mrs. Pell was measured about it. Not protective exactly, but accurate. "She's suggesting you're not in Black Creek for legitimate work, that you've developed personal motives that are," she chose carefully, "not professional." Evelyn was quiet for a moment. She looked at her tea. "And what does the town think?" "The town is divided the way towns always are," Mrs. Pell said. "Some people think Margot Vance talks too much and mind their own affairs. Some people find the situation interesting." A pause. "Helen at the dry goods store asked after you this morning. She wanted to know if you were all right." "That's kind of her." Helen is a practical woman. She was widowed 4 years ago and she managed her own business through it, and she has a particular view of women who work hard at things that need doing. She set her cup down. "I'm not telling you this to alarm you. I'm telling you so you know it's not unanimous." "It's never unanimous," Evelyn said. "About anything." Mrs. Pell nodded. "True." She stood up to leave and then paused. "I'll say one more thing, and then I'll leave you alone." "All right." Dawson Hale sent a letter 2 days ago, to me specifically, not the house, asking me to make sure you had everything you needed here and to put any additional expense on his account. She looked at Evelyn steadily. "I thought you should know." She left. Evelyn sat with her tea and thought about a letter sent to a boarding house to make sure she was comfortable, and thought about the various ways people communicated things they hadn't quite found direct words for yet. And then she picked up her notebook and went back to her notes, because there was still work to do. She was back at the ranch by Friday afternoon. The ride out with Pete was cold and clear, the sky that particular winter blue that had no warmth in it but was beautiful in its precision. The Hale Ranch came into view over the last rise with its square solid house and its working outbuildings and its kitchen garden under its covering of snow and she noticed that the fence on the west side had been repaired since she'd left, the down section from the storm properly replaced. Mara was on the porch when the wagon came up, which meant she'd been watching for it. "You were gone for 3 days," she said. "I was." "Lila said you'd be back Friday. Grandpa Silas said probably Saturday. Papa didn't say." "Your father was being appropriately cautious about things he couldn't control," Evelyn said. She climbed down with her bag. "I made biscuits," Mara said. "They came out a little flat." "Flat biscuits are still biscuits." "That's what I said." She held the door. "Lila said they were adequate, which she means as a compliment, but it doesn't feel like one." "It is a compliment," Evelyn said. "From Lila, adequate is the start of a good opinion." She went inside, and the warmth of the kitchen hit her the way it always did. And Silas looked up from his chair and gave her a nod that was several sentences compressed into a nod. And she set her bag down and took off her coat and felt something she didn't immediately name. Just a settling, a sense of the room being the right shape. Dawson came in at dusk, as he always did, and dinner was already on, and they sat down with the particular ease of people who had found their places at a table and stopped thinking about them. He asked her about the records work. She told him clearly what she'd found, what it documented, what Cross was preparing. He listened all the way through without interrupting, which was how he listened. 4 assessments, he said when she finished, all showing the same pattern, all connected to Vance's office, all below market, all resulting in transfers to Granger-related buyers. She looked at him. "It's not proof of coordination in a legal sense, but it's a pattern that a review board will need to address. It raises questions about the legitimacy of the process that supported Granger's petition. Granger's going to know you found this. He probably already does. Vance knew what I was looking at by the first afternoon." She paused. "It might accelerate things. If he knows the petition is going to face scrutiny of the official process that supported it, he has less incentive to let it go to formal review." Dawson turned his cup in his hands, a habit she'd noticed, the way he worked through things with small physical repetitions. "Cross thinks we're in a strong position. Cross thinks we've built a strong case. There's a difference." She held his gaze. "But yes, he's more confident than he was 2 months ago." He looked at her across the table. Silas already finished, the girls helping clear, the kitchen in its evening state. "You went in there and read 4 years of assessment records alone," he said. "I did. And you brought back exactly what we needed." "I brought back what the records showed," she said. "I just organized it." He looked at her for a moment, and she could see him choosing between several things he might say, and he chose none of them exactly, which was also like him. What he said was, "Thank you, Evelyn. I mean that." She looked at him steadily. "I know you do," she said. "That's why it's worth saying." The formal review request was submitted to the Territorial Survey Office in the second week of January, incorporating the original Hale survey documents, Clara's fence construction records, Pete's signed statement, which he'd given in his particular economical way, 6 sentences that said exactly what needed saying and nothing else, and Cross's formal summary of the assessment pattern connected to Vance and Granger. The wait was not comfortable. January was always a long month, and this one was longer than usual in the particular way that time stretched when you were waiting for an answer. The ranch work continued, because it always continued. Horses and fencing and supplies and the daily maintenance of life in a cold climate. Evelyn kept the household and kept the correspondence organized and kept herself from speculating too freely about what the survey office was doing with the packet of documents they'd been sent. Granger made no further direct appearances at the ranch, but through Cross they heard that his attorney had filed a response to the review request, which Cross described as aggressive in tone and thin on new evidence, which meant, Cross explained, that they were working with what they had and didn't have much more. That was either reassuring or ominous, depending on how you chose to read it. Leela, who had absorbed more of the situation than anyone had explicitly told her, came to Evelyn one evening in the 3rd week of January with a specific question. "If the survey comes back for us, does Granger have to accept it?" she said. "He can appeal," Evelyn said, "but a formal territorial survey is the strongest possible statement about where the boundary is. Appeals are expensive and difficult to win against documented survey results. So he'd probably stop. Probably." She looked at the girl. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking we have the fence records, and we have the original survey, And we have the assessment records you found, Lila said. That's 3 separate things that all say the same thing, so we should be all right. That's exactly right, Evelyn said. Lila nodded, as if filing this. Mama always said, keep documentation, she said. She used to say, a ranch without records is a ranch on trust, and trust doesn't hold up in legal proceedings. Your mother was very wise. I know. She said it simply, without grief or performance, just as a fact she was keeping. She went back to her book, and Evelyn sat with the sewing she'd been doing for Mara's coat, which needed a new button and a repaired hem, and the lamp between them made the small room warm, and the storm outside, a lighter one this time, just snow without serious wind, moved quietly against the windows. It was the kind of evening that didn't feel like anything in particular when you were inside it. Just an ordinary evening in January, in a house that was managing, with people who were learning each other's edges and making room. She put in the button with the deliberate small stitches that her mother's mother had shown her were the right way to do it. Not too tight, allowing for the give of fabric. And she thought about documentation and boundary lines and the careful records of a woman she'd never met who had understood that what you knew precisely was what you could defend. The surveyor team arrived at the ranch on the 28th of January, unannounced except by a brief letter from the survey office that had arrived 3 days before. There were 2 of them, a senior surveyor named Aldous Breck, who had the weathered practicality of a man who had spent 30 years confirming what the land actually was rather than what people claimed it was, and a younger assistant who did most of the physical work while Breck directed with careful authority. They spent 2 days at the property, which was 2 days of watching from a careful distance and doing the ordinary ranch work while they did theirs. Evelyn brought them coffee mid-morning on the first day, which Breck accepted without excessive gratitude, but with the straightforward appreciation of a cold man who had been working outside since 7 o'clock. She asked him once, on the second afternoon, how the work was going, and he gave her a response that was professionally neutral, but not evasive. The original survey markers are recoverable, he said. That's a good sign for a case like this. She thanked him and went back inside and told Dawson what he'd said, and Dawson processed it for a moment and then went back to the fence repair he'd been doing, which was his equivalent of managing the waiting. Breck came to the house on the evening of the second day, when the work was done and the light was failing. He sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and delivered his preliminary finding to Dawson with the tone of a man reporting what was true rather than what anyone wanted to hear. The original Hale boundary markers are confirmed, he said. The eastern boundary line runs as described in the 1851 survey, along the creek bed and continuation to the northern ridge. The markers we recovered are consistent with that description. Granger's claimed line would need to bisect the creek, which the terrain doesn't support, and the survey never indicated. He paused. My formal report will take 2 weeks to prepare, but I can tell you now that the documentary and physical evidence both support the original Hale boundary. The kitchen was quiet. Silas sat very still. The girls were upstairs, but the house was quiet enough that she suspected they were listening. Dawson said, "Thank you," and said it with the simplicity of a man who had heard the thing he needed to hear and wasn't going to make a ceremony of it. Breck left. The table sat in its usual kitchen silence for a moment, and then Mara's footsteps came down the stairs, too fast, clearly having given up on the pretense of not listening, and she came into the kitchen with her face open and expectant. "Did we win?" she said. "We have a strong preliminary finding," Evelyn said. "But probably yes?" Dawson looked at his daughter. "Probably yes," he said. Mara went back upstairs at a pace that suggested she had something to communicate to her sister, and Silas reached across the table and picked up his coffee cup and said, to no one in particular, "Your mother would have liked this." He said it to Dawson, not to Evelyn, but she heard it, and she understood who he meant, and she understood it was a complete sentence that didn't require a response. She got up and took the cups to the wash basin and stood at the sink and looked at the dark window over it, and she thought about 2 days and 4 assessment records, and a box of Clara Hale's household accounts, and the careful notation of a bearing line in a 40-year-old survey map. And she thought about how the things that held were the things that had been recorded precisely and kept somewhere someone could find them. She washed the cups. Outside, the January night was clear and very cold, and the eastern pasture sat exactly where it had always sat, and now someone official had walked its edge and confirmed what the land had always known about itself. Breck's formal report arrived on the 12th of February, delivered by the same mail rider who had carried Evelyn's original letter to the Territorial Survey Office back in December. The rider came up the track at mid-morning, and Evelyn was in the kitchen garden. Not gardening, it was still too cold for that, but walking the perimeter the way she'd taken to doing, checking what had shifted with the winter, thinking about what would need to go in first come April. She saw the rider and walked to meet him at the gate, and she carried the envelope inside and set it on the kitchen table and did not open it because it was addressed to Dawson Hale, and she had a firm sense of what belonged to whom. She found him in the barn. "Letter from the survey office," she said. He came in from the barn without taking his gloves off and picked it up and stood at the kitchen table and read it. She put the kettle on and stayed at the stove with her back to him because he was a man who processed things better without being watched. It took him about 4 minutes to read a 2-page document, which told her he was reading it twice. "It confirms the boundary," he said. She turned around. He was still looking at the pages, not at her. "All of it," he said. "The creek line, the northern ridge extension, all of it matches the original Hale survey. Breck's team found 3 of the original boundary markers still in place." He set the papers down. He notes that the markers are consistent with 40 years of boundary usage and that there is no physical or documentary evidence to support the alternate line proposed in Granger's petition. "That's the language you need," she said. "Yes." He looked up at her now. Cross said a formal survey report at this level is the strongest possible statement, that Granger would be appealing against physical evidence and official documentation both. "He could still appeal," she said. "He could." His voice was even. "But he'd lose, and he'd spend money losing, and Cross thinks—" He paused. "Cross thinks that when Granger sees this report, he'll withdraw. That this has always been about whether the Hales would fight it properly or give up and sell. Now that we've fought it properly, the cost-benefit stops working in his favor." She poured the water into the pot and said nothing for a moment. She was thinking about Granger on his horse in the yard in December, looking at the property with that calculating quality, and she was thinking about the particular brand of person who pursued things only as long as they were cheaper than the alternative. And she thought Cross was probably right. "Send it to Cross today," she said. "He'll want to prepare a formal response to Granger's attorney. The sooner Granger sees the report, the sooner he makes his decision." "I'll go in this afternoon." She set his cup of coffee on the table. He picked it up and looked at it, and then looked at her. And there was something in his expression that she'd been peripherally aware of for several weeks now. Something that had been building in the way that things built in people who weren't impulsive, slowly and with considerable internal deliberation. He didn't say it yet. She didn't push. "Thank you," he said instead. The same 2 words he'd said before, but with different weight this time. More of it. "I'll have dinner early," she said, "so you can leave before the light goes." Cross received the report and prepared his formal response within 3 days, which was fast for Cross, and told her something about how seriously he was taking the moment. He sent a copy of his summary letter to Granger's attorney, a man named Ferris, based in the county seat 40 miles south, along with a formal notice that the Hale family was prepared to defend the survey's findings at every level of appeal available, and that the documentation of the assessment irregularities connected to Robert Vance's office had been preserved and would be submitted to the Territorial Review Board as supporting evidence of procedural compromise in the original petition. That last part, Cross told Dawson privately, was the part Granger would find most uncomfortable. A boundary dispute was one thing. A documented pattern suggesting that the official process supporting his petition had been compromised by a connected assessor. That was something that could follow Granger into other dealings, other county business, other land pursuits. Men like Granger survived by keeping their methods invisible. The assessment pattern Evelyn had found and documented made the method visible. Ferris sent a response 12 days later. It was 3 paragraphs, formal and measured, stating that his client had reviewed the territorial survey findings and, in the interest of resolving the matter without further procedural cost, was withdrawing the boundary petition. Cross came out to the ranch himself to deliver this news, which was unusual enough that when Evelyn saw his horse coming up the track on a Thursday afternoon, she felt something shift in her chest before she'd consciously registered what it might mean. He came in and sat at the kitchen table, the same table where they'd all had breakfast and dinner for 3 months, the table that had held survey maps and Clara's account books and Evelyn's notebooks, and he told them what the letter said. Silas made a sound she'd never heard from him before. Not a word, just a sound. Compressed, relieved, the sound of a man who had been holding something for a long time and had just been permitted to set it down. Mara, who was standing in the doorway because she was always standing in doorways when things happened, said, "So it's over?" "The petition is withdrawn," Cross said. "Yes." "And they can't just do it again?" "A withdrawn petition with a formal survey finding on record is considerably harder to refile. Granger would need substantially new evidence to reopen it, and there isn't any." Cross looked at Dawson. "The land is yours, as it always was." Dawson sat with his hands on the table and said nothing for a moment. She watched him and thought about the man who had gone alone at 24 to negotiate for his stolen cattle and had stayed there 3 hours until the other man ran out of arguments. And she thought about how some people's strength was the kind that made noise, and some people's strength was the kind that just kept standing until the noise stopped. And she thought that this man was the second kind and always had been. "Thank you, Leland," he said. Cross nodded. "Miss Hart did the critical work," he said. "I want that on the record." "I know," Dawson said. He wasn't looking at Cross when he said it. Sad. The withdrawal settled over the ranch like the first real thaw of early spring, slowly, without announcement, detectable mainly by what stopped rather than what started. The particular tension that had been present in every conversation about town, every trip to the registry office, every letter sent and received, it eased. Not all at once. These things didn't ease all at once, but it eased. Robert Vance's position at the registry office came under quiet review by the Territorial Administration the following month, prompted by Cross's formal submission of the assessment pattern documentation. Nothing dramatic happened quickly. These things never did. But the review was opened, and the record existed, and men in positions that depended on invisible methods did not thrive when the method had been made visible and filed. Word reached Black Creek in the ordinary way of small-town information, and the word was that Vance had requested a transfer to a different county office. Whether that transfer was granted or whether it was the kind of request that amounted to a resignation wearing different clothes, nobody seemed certain, but Margot Vance stopped coming to the milliners on Thursdays, which was the most concrete evidence available. Evelyn did not feel triumphant about this. She wasn't built for triumph. What she felt was closer to the quiet satisfaction of a completed task, the way a supply cupboard looked when it was properly organized, when everything had its place and the place made sense. She had looked at the records. She had found what was there. That was the work, and the work was done. What remained was harder to categorize. She was still at the Hale Ranch in February, which had not been the original arrangement. The original arrangement had been 1 week, and then a conversation about wages and the room off the kitchen. And neither of those conversations had included an end date because neither of them had addressed the fact that an indefinite arrangement was still, ultimately, an arrangement of a particular kind. She was an employee. The room was a condition of employment. When the land claim was resolved and the household was running and the girls were older, what she was doing here would either need to be named or it would need to end. She knew this. She had always known it. She was not a person who let herself not know things because not knowing was more comfortable. What she hadn't let herself examine too closely was the other part, the part that had been building in the kitchen over coffee at night, in the particular quality of Dawson's attention across the dinner table, in the way he'd sent a letter to Mrs. Pell when she was in town to make sure she had what she needed, in the 2 words he said when something mattered to him and he wanted her to understand it mattered. She was examining it now, in early February, on an afternoon when the light had the first faint quality of something that might become spring. Not warm, not even close, but slightly less committed to cold than it had been, sitting at the desk in the main room with no particular task in front of her for the first time in 3 months. She was 31 years old. She had lived in 6 places and worked for 9 households and carried everything she owned in a medium-sized leather case. She had been, at every stop, useful and reliable and professional, and at every stop she had also been not quite permanent, not quite belonging. The person who managed things well, and then, when the management was done, or the situation changed, or someone decided they wanted something smaller, moved on. She had told herself that this was what she wanted, that portable was what she needed, that belonging to a place too much was a liability for a woman in her situation. She sat at the desk in the warm afternoon light and thought about that story she'd been telling herself, And she thought about whether it had ever been true or whether it was the story you told yourself after you'd been not quite permanent enough times that you decided to make it sound like a choice. She didn't have an answer. But she was aware that she'd stopped making plans to leave, which was its own answer of a kind. Dawson found her at the desk. This was not unusual. She was often at the desk, and he often came through the main room in the late afternoon on his way from the barn to the kitchen. What was unusual was that he stopped, and then he stayed stopped, and he stood in the middle of the room with the look of a man who had been rehearsing something and was now deciding whether the rehearsed version was the honest version or just the managed one. She turned in her chair. She waited. He sat down in the chair across from the desk, the chair Silas sometimes used, the old one with the repaired arm, and he put his hands on his knees and looked at her and said, "I need to say something." "All right," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Not the processing quiet, the other kind, the kind where you've already processed and now you're deciding whether saying it will change things in ways you haven't fully calculated. She recognized it because she'd been inside it herself more than once this past month. "The situation here," he started. Stopped. Started again. "What you've done here, the household, the legal work, the land claim, I don't know how to tell you what that's meant without it sounding like I'm tallying a debt. I'm not tallying a debt." "I know," she said. "What I mean is," he looked at her directly. Dawson Hale looked at things directly when he was saying something true. "I want you to stay. Not because the household needs managing, although it does. Not because there's more work, although there is. I want you to stay because—" He paused, and she could see him choosing, and what he chose was simple and therefore probably the true version. "Because when you're not here, the house is a different house, and the different house is worse." She sat with this for a moment. It was not a declaration out of a storybook. It was nothing like what she'd heard other people describe when they talked about love or partnership or the moment someone asked you to stay. It wasn't romantic in the way that word usually implied. It was specific and a little awkward and entirely honest. And that combination was, for her, more affecting than poetry would have been. "You're saying you want me to stay," she said. Not a question, making sure she was hearing it accurately. "I'm saying I want you to stay," he said, as another pause. He wasn't a man who struggled with words usually, but he was struggling now, and she didn't rescue him from it because the struggling was important. "As my wife," he said, "if that's something you'd want. I'm not asking you to want it because it's sensible or because it resolves the question of the arrangement. I'm asking you because it's true." The room was quiet. The stove in the kitchen made its ordinary sounds. Outside, one of the horses moved in the corral with the particular percussion of hooves on frozen ground. She looked at him, this man who checked the sky every morning before coffee, who had 3 hours of patience for a negotiation he could have resolved with anger, who had sent a letter to a boarding house to make sure she had what she needed, who had laughed when she said she didn't need to be told things twice and then never told her anything twice, who ran his hands flat on the table when he was working something out and said all right when he'd decided to trust someone with something. She thought about Portable. She thought about what she'd told herself about not belonging too much. She thought about Lila saying she'd have liked you with that private, surprised expression. She thought about Mara asking questions from every doorway in the house. She thought about Silas and his 7 armloads of firewood and his liniment on the shelf. She thought about the desk she'd cleared, which was her desk now in any practical sense, and the kitchen that knew where everything was because she had put it there, and the kitchen garden she'd been walking the perimeter of this morning, thinking about what would go in come April. She thought about the years of being not quite permanent, and about how at some point choosing not to belong was indistinguishable from being afraid of it, and about whether she was going to keep being afraid of it or whether she was going to do what she'd done in December on the train platform, set her bag down and turn around and face what was in front of her. "I need to say something back," she said. "All right. I came to Black Creek with $11 and a position that had already fallen through," she said. "I was not looking for this. I wasn't looking for any version of this." She held his gaze. "But I stopped making plans to leave some time ago. I noticed it, and I didn't change it, which is its own kind of answer." He looked at her. "I'm not easy," she said. "I have opinions, and they don't disappear because someone finds them inconvenient. I'm going to manage this household the way I manage it, and I'm going to keep records and write letters and go through registry documents when that's what's needed, and I'm not going to make myself smaller to fit a shape that someone else decides I should be. I know, he said. He said it the same way he said I know when she told him about a fence problem she'd already started planning to fix. Acknowledgement, not concession. Then yes, she said. If you're asking because it's true, then yes. The room was quiet again, but it was a different quiet. Something had settled into it that hadn't been there before. He reached across the desk and put his hand over hers for a moment. Just a moment, nothing elaborate. And then he sat back, and they looked at each other with the slightly dazed expression of two people who had just said something real and were now coexisting with having said it. I should tell the girls, he said. Mara is probably already listening from the stairs, she said. He turned to look at the doorway. There was a beat of silence and then the sound of footsteps retreating rapidly upward, which confirmed it. He looked back at Evelyn, and then he laughed, the same caught-off-guard laugh she'd heard from him once before, the one that escaped before he'd approved it. And she found herself laughing too, which she hadn't expected, and the laughter lasted longer than it had any logical reason to, the way laughter sometimes did when it was covering something larger than amusement. They were married in March, when the ground had softened enough to suggest that the worst of winter was genuinely behind them. There was no large gathering because neither of them wanted one. There was a justice of the peace in Black Creek, a man named Hooper, who was pragmatic about such arrangements and asked no unnecessary questions. And there were Silas and the girls and Mrs. Pell, who had put on a good coat for the occasion, and Pete, who stood in the back of the justice's office with his hat in his hands, looking like he wasn't sure what to do with his face, which was entirely Pete. Lila stood next to her father with a composed expression that Evelyn had come to understand was Lila's way of experiencing things that mattered. Very still, very present, not performing anything. At some point during the brief proceedings, she moved slightly closer to Evelyn, just by a few inches, close enough that their arms nearly touched. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Mara cried, which surprised everyone, including Mara, and she was loudly affronted by her own tears and wiped them away with the back of her hand and said it was just because the room was dusty, which nobody believed. Afterward, Mrs. Pell produced a cake from somewhere, a real one, not a gesture of a cake, and they ate it at the kitchen table of the Hale Ranch in the middle of a March afternoon, with the light coming through the south-facing windows and the first mud of true thaw visible through the kitchen door. Silas ate 2 pieces of cake and said to the table, "Your grandfather would have liked this day." He said it to Dawson, and Dawson nodded, and that was all the ceremony the moment required. But spring came in. The way spring came to this part of the territory, argumentatively, in fits, with warm days followed by cold snaps that killed optimism, and then warm days again. The kitchen garden came back. Evelyn had spent an afternoon in late March clearing the beds and assessing what had survived winter, and she found, under the straw mulch she'd added in November, that the root vegetables had come through better than expected. She planted the first things in early April, hardy greens, onion sets, the early peas that could take cold, and she did it with Mara helping in the particular way Mara helped with things, which was enthusiastically and with many questions and the occasional loss of focus. "Why do you plant the peas so shallow?" Mara asked. "They need light to germinate," Evelyn said. "What's germinate?" "Wake up," Evelyn said. "Start growing." Mara pressed seeds into the row they'd made with a stick, with the concentration of a child performing an important task. "Do they know they're supposed to grow?" "They don't know anything," Evelyn said. "They just do what they're built to do when the conditions are right." Mara thought about this. "That seems easier than being a person," she said. "It does," Evelyn said, "but peas can't choose to stay somewhere. They just grow where they're planted." Mara looked up at her. She had her mother's eyes. Evelyn had learned this from a photograph Silas kept on the shelf in his room, which she'd seen once when she'd brought his liniment. Dark, direct, the kind of eyes that looked at things rather than past them. "Is that better?" Mara asked. "To choose?" "Yes," Evelyn said, without hesitation, "even when it's harder." Mara went back to pressing seeds into the row, and Evelyn worked beside her in the cold spring light, and she thought about choosing, about the long, accumulating series of small choices that had brought her here. Not one dramatic decision, but 100 practical ones, each one made in the face of the actual situation rather than the situation she'd imagined. She had chosen to wait on a cold platform. She had chosen to walk into town. She had chosen to introduce herself to an old man in a dry goods store. She had chosen to look at survey maps on a Sunday morning and go through 4 years of assessment records in a cold back room and hold a barn door in a storm until her hand stopped working properly. She had chosen to stay when staying wasn't comfortable and the outcome wasn't certain. Nobody had given her this place. It hadn't been handed to her with a letter and a train ticket and someone waiting at the station. She had built her way into it the way the fence had been built along the eastern boundary, one post at a time, documented and confirmed, standing exactly where it was supposed to stand. That was the thing she understood now, that she hadn't understood before. Not in her bones the way she understood it now. Belonging wasn't a place you arrived at. It wasn't offered to you by the right person at the right time. And if you waited for someone to offer it, you could wait a long time. You built it. You built it by showing up reliably and doing the work honestly and staying when staying required something from you. Not because you had nowhere else to go, but because you had decided this was where you were going to be. The peas would come up in 3 weeks. The onions would follow. By June, the garden would be producing, and she'd put up the surplus the way she always put up surplus, in the labeled jars that went on the cold pantry shelf in the order they'd been made. This would be her 4th month on this land, and next year she'd know the garden better, and the year after better still. And someday she'd be the one who knew where every bed was and what each one did best, the way Clara had known it, the way Clara had recorded it, the way knowledge passed between people who cared about the same piece of ground. The land claim never resurfaced. Granger sold 3 of his western properties by summer, not in distress exactly, but without the expansive confidence that had characterized his earlier movements in the county. Robert Vance did transfer to another office, one considerably smaller and further from any land of consequence. Whether either man was chastened or merely repositioning for another approach somewhere else was the kind of question that couldn't be answered from where Evelyn stood, and she made her peace with that. Frontier justice was not clean. It was not the kind of resolution where everyone understood what had happened and drew the correct lesson and changed accordingly. What it was that the Hales had their land and the documentation to defend it, and the people who had tried to take it had found the cost too high. That was enough. It would have to be. Cross came by the ranch once in June, ostensibly about a minor documentation matter, but actually, Evelyn suspected, because he wanted to see how things had settled. He sat at the kitchen table. He always sat at the kitchen table, which was where the actual business of the household occurred, and drank coffee and talked with Dawson about the summer range and with Silas about an old acquaintance they shared. And when he left, he paused at the door and said to Evelyn, "You did good work here." She said, "We did." He smiled at the "we" without comment on it, put his hat on, and rode back to town. On an evening in late June, when the light lasted until nearly 9 and the air had the specific warmth of summer on the high range, dry and clean and carrying the smell of grass and distance, Evelyn walked the perimeter of the kitchen garden the way she'd taken to doing, checking the week's progress, noting what needed attention. The peas had come and gone. She was growing tomatoes now, and squash, and the beans had gone in along the eastern fence in a row that was doing better than she'd expected for a first-year planting. She stopped at the eastern edge of the garden and looked out across the property. The outbuildings, the barn where the horses were settling for the evening, the fence line running north toward the ridge, and beyond it, the eastern pasture that Granger had wanted and hadn't gotten, that stretched flat and good to the line of the creek shining in the late light. Dawson came up beside her. He'd been checking the horses. She could tell by the smell of hay and the particular look of a man who had done his last outdoor task for the day and was now in the brief space between work and evening. He stood next to her and looked at what she was looking at. "Beans are doing well," he said. "Better than I expected for new ground," she said. "Next year I'll amend the soil on the south end. It's running a little thin." "You're already planning next year," he said. "I'm always already planning next year," she said. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the pasture. The creek caught the last light in pieces, bright and irregular. "You know what I thought when Breck's report came in?" he said. "What?" "That I was glad you were here for it." He said it simply, looking at the pasture rather than at her. "Not just glad it happened. Glad you were here when it happened. That's different." She looked at him. He had the look of a man who had found, over these months, that honesty was easier than he'd expected when you were saying it to the right person. "I know," she said. "I was glad too." They stood there for a while in the long summer evening, not talking, looking at the land that ran out to the creek and the ridge and the sky above them, and the ranch behind them made its ordinary sounds. The horses, the chickens, somewhere inside Mara's voice asking Lila something, and Lila's response too low to make out, but audible, warm, present. She thought about the train platform in December. She thought about standing in the cold with her bag at her feet, and the last train car disappearing into the gray, and how the feeling of that moment had been the feeling of someone who had run out of arrangements and was standing at the edge of whatever came next. She had not known, on that platform, that what came next was this. She hadn't even known what this looked like yet, but she had turned around. That was the thing. She had turned around and walked into what was in front of her, and she had kept walking. And she had done the work that needed doing, and she had stayed when staying required something from her. And here was the result. Not a life that looked the way she'd been told a life should look. Not a version of belonging that came with a letter and a promised reception. Something else. Something that had her name on it because she'd been the one to build it. She had spent years being told, in various polite and professional ways, that she was good at her work but not quite the right fit. Too present. Too much. Not the shape the space required. And she had tried, for a time, to be less, to compress herself into the dimensions that were wanted, and it had never worked, and she had never been able to sustain it for long, because you couldn't sustain something that contradicted what you actually were. What she actually was had turned out to be exactly what this place required. Not because the place was perfect for her. It wasn't. Not always. Not in every way. But because she had shown up as herself, and the place had made room, and the people in it had made room, and she had made room for them in return. And that exchange of room was what belonging actually looked like when it wasn't a fairy story. Not someone waiting at the platform. Not an offer extended with no conditions. Just people deciding, one day at a time, to make room for each other. And staying. The light was going now, tipping the grass gold before it went. Inside the house, a lamp came on in the kitchen window. "Come in when you're ready," Dawson said. He touched her hand once, briefly, and walked back toward the house. She stayed a moment longer. She looked at the eastern pasture, the creek line dark now, the ridge against the pale sky, the boundary exactly where it had always been, confirmed and documented, and hers by marriage and by months of honest work and by the simple fact that she had chosen it. Then she walked back toward the lit window and the warm kitchen and the voices inside, and she closed the garden gate behind her and she went in.